All right. Um, so thank you everyone for joining us. And I would like to especially thank Dr. Nazal Ghanoush, who's joining us to talk about criminal justice reform and really what that means, particularly in terms of some of the research that she does at the Sentencing Project, where she's a senior research analyst who conducts and synthesizes research on criminal justice policies specific to things like racial disparities in the justice system, public opinions about punishment, and the scope of reform efforts. She has presented to academics, practitioners, and general audiences, and her work has been in outlets including the Washington Post, the New York Times, and WNYC's On the Media. And she also edits the Sentencing Project's Race and Justice newsletter. So with that introduction, I will leave it in your very capable hands, Nazgul.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be with you all today, and I'm really envious of the fact that you're debaters because I feel like I could do my job so much better if I had had debating experience. So oftentimes I just try to imagine that I did and channel the strengths that you guys bring to the kinds of arguments that you make. So let's see how I do, and I want to try to help you with the debates that you're going to be engaging in around this issue. So I'm a senior researcher at the Sentencing Project. I've been there for, let's see now, over 6 years. And a lot of what I do is conduct my own research and synthesize research that's been done by others, especially within universities, and help to make that more accessible for the general public so that policymakers, reporters, and people that are voting on issues can make the most informed decisions possible about what we should have as the policies in our criminal justice system. So today what I'm going to do is talk to you about two different sets of topics. First, I'm going to talk to you about what's been happening with the overall scale of incarceration in the United States, how it has grown and how it's started to how the numbers have started to come down recently. And then I'm going to talk to you about racial disparities in incarceration, what the sources of racial and ethnic disparities are, and what has been done around the country to tackle that. So let me start sharing my screen with you. Okay, here we go. Okay, so I hope you're able to see my title slide here, which says, "Can we wait 65 years to end mass incarceration?" And I'll explain to you why I picked that 65-year figure soon. So just so you have it, my email information and my Twitter account are there in case you want to get connected after this talk. Okay, so here we go. So this is a chart that's very familiar to people that think about issues of mass incarceration. This is showing you the growth of the prison population in the United States. I think there are a couple of very notable things to observe here. One of them is that the United States has not always had a mass incarceration problem. If you look before the mid-1970s, our imprisonment levels were under 200,000, and in 2017, which is the most recent year for this chart, it had reached 1.4 million. And so this is just people that are in prison serving sentences typically of 1 year or longer. When you sometimes hear on this topic people talking about 2.2 million people incarcerated, that's because that figure includes another about 800,000 or so that are in jails around the country. So that's how you get to 2.2 million people in jails. When you look at the jail population, about half of that population, a little more than half, is there held pre-trial. They've not yet been convicted or found to be guilty. They're waiting for their case to get processed. It's called pre-trial, but really most people don't go through a trial for their case. They get a plea offer. And so much of what happens in criminal justice that either lands people behind bars or gives them a probation or a probation sentence or a jail sentence of less than a year typically, that all gets negotiated through a plea negotiation with a prosecutor. The kinds of cases that usually go to trial tend to be the most serious kinds of cases, like homicide cases. Okay, so this is showing you the growth of the prison population, and you can see that it's about 7 times as high as it was in the 1970s. So Um, just a little bit more of a footnote here is of this 1.4 million people that are in prisons around the country, most of them are in state prisons. So every state runs its own prison system. In addition to that, the federal government has its own prison system, and federal prisons hold 160,000 people around the country. And so if you have been convicted of a federal offense, you get sent to federal prison. But if you've been convicted of a state offense, you get sent to state prison. Okay, so you can see this dramatic growth in incarceration levels. And I don't know if you can notice it, but in the last couple of years, there's been a slight reduction in the prison population. And that's sort of the thing that gets us helps us wake up in the morning and keeps us motivated in the criminal justice research and advocacy world. That little bit of progress is what we're trying to build on. And what I want you to realize about this chart is, a couple questions might come to mind. One of them is, why is it that we have so many more people behind bars now compared to the 1970s and the earlier era? So what happened around the 1970s? A lot of people that look at this issue and historians that try to figure out what happened, why do we have a mass incarceration problem, they'll point to a couple of different factors. And one of them is that the United States became just much more punitive starting in the 1970s. If you got arrested, you're more likely to get sent to prison. If you got sent to prison, you're more likely to go there for a longer period of time. And there is just a dramatic increase in the war on drugs as well, which increased arrests and sentence lengths for drug convictions. So those are sort of the nuts and bolts of how this happened. But the historical context is really important to know about. So these policies were partly a backlash to the civil rights movement and white Americans being frustrated about protests in the street and the demands that Black Americans were making. So it sounds kind of familiar, right? It was also in response to rising crime rates beginning around the 1970s and continuing until the 1990s. Crime rates went up dramatically around the country, and they actually did around the world. So pretty much, any city that you would go to during the 1990s, you would have more of a feeling, less of a feeling of safety than if you went than now. And this was true for many different parts of the world. But the United States was exceptional in dramatically increasing its prison population in response to this uptick in crime. And then crime rates started to fall starting in the mid-90s. And right now, if you look at things like violent crime, property crime, homicide, they're about half the level they used to be at in the 1990s. So right now, relative to that peak era of the 90s, our communities are much safer than they used to be. And that's actually, again, something that's happened around the world. And so I think that's one of the best explanations for why we don't need to have mass incarceration in order to have safe communities. The United States is the only country where, in response to this uptick in crime, we dramatically increased imprisonment levels, and we continue to dramatically increase imprisonment levels even as crime rates fell after the 1990s. And so we know when we look at other countries that didn't change incarceration levels but still experienced a crime drop, that we don't need to have this many people behind bars in order to have safe communities. Okay, so before I ask you this question, let me just quantify this for you. So the prison population reached its peak level in 2009. And since then, it has come down by 9% between 2009 and 2018, which is just 1 year after this chart. The prison population, the size has come down by 9%. But remember I mentioned to you that crime rates are about half the level that they used to be at. So I think in some ways, if you expect incarceration and crime to move together, you would expect the incarceration level to come down by half, but it hasn't. And I think to understand why that is, it's important to understand who is in prison and what people are serving time for. So here's a question that I have for you. What proportion of the prison population is serving time for a drug offense? What's your sense of how many of the, if you as a percentage of people that are in prison, how many are there for a drug offense? And let me switch my windows here so that I can see you all and see some of your responses. I wonder what's the best way for me to see your responses. Can you type them in maybe? I'll take a look at the chat and see. Curious to see your guesses. Okay, someone said 55%. Let's see other guesses. Great. Okay, great, thank you. So I see a range of around between 36% to about 70%. This is great. Okay, now let me go back. I can show you, I can tell you what the answer is. So this is a bit of a trick question that I often like to pose because people generally don't guess right. The answer to this question is 19%, 19%, okay? It's a much smaller proportion than a lot of people think because a couple different reasons. One reason is, for example, the wonderful book that Michelle Alexander wrote, The New Jim Crow, which has helped to get a lot of people interested and upset, rightly upset about what happens in our criminal justice system. She really focuses on drug offenses. And I think that's part of why a lot of people focus on drug offenses. And it's not just her, it's also a lot of the criminal justice advocacy that's happened has focused on people with drug convictions or nonviolent convictions more generally. Partly because advocates have recognized that that's the group that people, Americans, are most likely to be empathetic towards. That's the group that people are most likely to get to the point now where if you survey Americans and ask them, what do you think about mandatory minimums for drug offenses? A majority now say they're opposed to them. So that's part of the work that's been done to educate people about excessive punishment for drug offenses. I think another reason why people think drug offenses are such a high proportion of the convictions that people are in prison for is because of the federal prison population. Those 160,000 people that are in federal prisons, over 40% of them are there for a drug offense. So federal prisons have a different kind of nature than state prisons, where if you look at state prisons, actually if you look at prisons overall, half of the prison population is there for a violent crime, a violent conviction. And that includes crimes like assault and robbery. Those are considered violent crimes, but also more serious crimes like rape and murder, okay? And it's much harder to, I think, even if you potentially, even for yourself, if you think about, do you support mass incarceration? Yes or no? Maybe not. What do you think about scaling back sentences for people with violent convictions? Might make you a little bit uneasy, right? But I'm going to tell you more about why we need to scale back penalties for violent convictions if we want to have a chance of ending mass incarceration within our lifetime. So I mentioned 19% of the population is there for a drug offense, about half for a violent crime, another 17% is there for a property crime. And then other people have things like weapon convictions, or they're there for just an immigration law violation in the federal system, for example. So that's what the prison population is, that's how it's sort of comprised if you look at it by conviction offense. So let me just add a footnote here that I don't want to understate the effect of the drug war. A lot of the people that are in prison for a violent conviction or for a property offense, they are there because they violated the terms of their probation or parole just because they had drugs in their system or they had drugs on them, and so they got sent back to prison and they are counted as under their original offense. Moreover, because of our drug war and because of its failure to get people access to drug treatment when they need it and make it affordable for them, a lot of the crimes that people get sent to prison for that aren't drug crimes might not have happened if people who have substance use disorder, which is a considerable share of the prison population, if they had been able to be effectively treated, if they had access to mental health treatment and so on. So the scale of the drug war is beyond just and the ineffectiveness of the drug war is beyond just the number of people in prison with a drug conviction. So this is a chart that shows you changes in the prison population over time by the conviction offense. So you can see that the line at the top is the number of people in prison with a violent conviction. And when you look and you see how that line is much higher than the line for a drug or property offense. I'm just going to focus on those three general categories of crime. And the number of people in prison for violent conviction has come down by about 2% since 2009. On the other hand, if you look at drug and property conviction, people serving time in prison for those offenses, the number has come down much more. The number of people in prison for a drug offense has come down by 26%, and those in prison for a property crime has come down by 14%. Okay, so Let me also just pause here and make a tell you a little bit about how. So these figures end at 2016. Some of the numbers I shared with you earlier went up till 2018. Since 2018, we don't have national prison counts yet, but what we know from the analyses that other organizations have done, like the Vera Institute of Justice, the UCLA COVID Behind Bars Project, we know that the prison population has come down modestly since then, not dramatically, really quite modestly. And we know that the best progress that's been made in bringing people out of prisons and correctional institutions, that's actually happened at the level of jails. A lot of people that would have been held pre-trial in jails are either not being sent or have been released home, so as to reduce the overcrowding in these facilities and reduce the number of people that are at risk of contracting COVID-19 behind bars. Okay, so that's just to bring you sort of up to date to where we are today. And when you hear about in the news or read about the responses from governors or the president or mayors to COVID-19 in terms of the correctional population, most of the progress is happening in reducing the number in jails, not so much in prisons where people are serving sentences of a year or longer. Okay, so let me show you this chart, which is showing you how much states have reduced their prison populations since reaching their peak levels. So at the very bottom, you can see the average in the United States. Remember, I mentioned that since 2009, the US prison population is down by 9% between 2009 and 2018. Now, I won't show you the states that fall below that average, where they're way behind in terms of other states in reducing their prison populations. But I want to show you the states that are doing the best, like New Jersey, Connecticut, New York. They've reduced their prison populations by more than 30%. So when we look below the national level at the state level, we can see that some states are really doing quite a lot to reduce overall prison populations. And they actually still have a long way to go if they want to end mass incarceration. But this just goes to show that some states have demonstrated that it's possible to make dramatic reductions in the prison population. And at the same time, while these states have done this, they have outpaced the nationwide crime drop. So remember, I mentioned crime rates have fallen by half since the 1990s. In some of these states that have reduced their prison populations, crime rate really dramatically, crime rates have fallen even more than that. And at the same time, in most of the country, crime rates have fallen significantly, and in many parts of the country, in most states, the reduction in the prison population has been less than 10%. So really quite modest. So it's not the case. We don't see a one-to-one relationship between when crime goes up, incarceration goes up. When crime comes down, incarceration goes down. We see it happening in some states, but it really requires a lot of advocacy and work to scale back incarceration levels. And so I started off by talking to you, the title of this presentation was, can we wait 65 years to end mass incarceration? To be more specific, what I mean is, can we even wait 65 years to cut the prison population in half? According to our analysis at the Sentencing Project, at the recent pace of decarceration, which has been about 1% a year, if we keep going at this rate of reducing the prison population, it's going to take 65 years to cut the prison population in half. Even that, I would say, is not, cutting it in half is not the same as ending mass incarceration. But I think that a lot of people would agree that's way too slow. That's not the kind of timeline that we have in mind when we want to end the problem of mass incarceration. We want to move faster than that, and we want to solve this problem sooner. So I want to let you know about some of the efforts to tackle that top line that I was showing you, the number of people in prison serving time for a violent offense. We at the Sentencing Project have a campaign that's over a year old now to end life imprisonment. So based on our research, we know that 1 in 7 people in prison is serving a life sentence. And so that's a sentence of either life with or without the possibility of parole, or a sentence that's 50 years or longer, which one would reasonably expect would keep someone in prison for the rest of their lives. So our goal is to encourage policymakers to limit prison sentences to 20 years. There are a number of European countries that have similar kinds of policies, and they say we're going to limit, like for example, Norway has a policy of limiting sentences to 21 years. Once you've reached the 21-year point, they will reassess the individual, and if they're not safe, they can continue to incarcerate them. The point that we try to make is that we should be doing something similar. At the time of sentencing, we shouldn't decide that someone is irredeemable, that it's impossible for them to rehabilitate. We should give everybody a possibility and invest in their rehabilitation. And if it doesn't work and if they failed, then we can continue to incarcerate them, but not impose sentences of longer than 20 years at the time of sentencing. This discussion is relevant for people generally who have committed very serious crimes. While there, I think, are over 10,000 people that are serving life sentences for nonviolent offenses, most people that are in prison for serving a life sentence have committed serious crimes like homicide. But the argument that we make is that based on the criminological evidence, people that are the people that are serving life sentences generally age out of crime. Crime, very serious violent crime especially, is typically something that people engage in their late teens or early 20s. And you can see very clearly if you look at self-reporting of criminal activity and arrest data, that people then move away from criminal activity as their brain matures and as they develop as they get older. And so imprisoning old people, elderly people who don't pose a public safety risk, it just doesn't make sense from a policy perspective, and it especially doesn't make sense from a perspective of what do we do with our limited public safety dollars? Do we use them to imprison elderly people who are much more expensive to incarcerate than younger people, or should we use them for more effective investments in public safety, which in my view include investments like increasing access to high quality early education, so preschool, universal preschool, increasing investments in residential mobility to tackle problems of residential segregation, increasing investments to make sure that everyone has access to health care. And so that includes access to drug treatment and mental health care when they need it. Those are the kinds of policies and investments that would be much more effective in tackling crime than imprisoning elderly people. Another argument that people make in support of very long sentences is that they think that it can be a deterrent, that if you know that you're going to go away to prison for a long time, you're not going to commit an offense. That's the argument. That's the deterrent argument. That's a nice thought experiment that that's actually how things work. But in reality, how things work is that people tend to get away with crime and they expect to get away with crime. If you even look at homicide clearance rates, most police departments really struggle to solve the majority of their homicide cases. Their homicide clearance rates are somewhere between 60 to 70%. So deterrence is effective if people expect to be caught and punished, not if they expect to be able to get away with it. And so that's a problem with the deterrence argument about supporting life sentences. Okay, so that's sort of where we're at in terms of our advocacy and how we try to connect people to the research on long sentences. But I also want to tell you about some specific examples where very long sentences have been scaled back for violent crimes. So this is a group, for example, I'll be brief here, of people that are serving life sentences in Maryland, and they were released a couple years ago as a result of a court case that was in the name of one of the individuals whose name was Unger. So this was the Unger versus Maryland case. If it weren't for this case, all of these individuals would still be in prison right now in Maryland, because Maryland has a system where once the parole board approves someone for release, the governor has to okay that, and governors in recent history have been very reluctant to let anybody go because they just don't want any bad press coverage of governor okayed the release of such and such person who committed this horrific crime 30, 40 years ago. Or on the off chance that someone does recidivate, they don't want that associated with them politically. But what we know is from the release of individuals like this, they have extremely low recidivism rates. These individuals are some of the people that are the least likely to ever get sent back to prison for reoffending once they're released. And so this is one example of many of people that have been released after serving very long sentences who have been really quite successful in their reentry. And let me show you tell you a couple stories about the people pictured here that have been doing work to scale back penalties, very long penalties for violent crimes. So on the top left is Larry Krasner, and he's there with State Senator Sharif Street in Pennsylvania. Krasner is the district attorney in Philadelphia. And Krasner is a very progressive district attorney, and he has been supportive of scaling back sentences for violent crimes and for homicides in Philadelphia, and has endorsed legislation by Sharif Street to allow everybody that's in prison serving a life without parole sentence in that state to get a second look, for judges to reopen their sentence and reopen their case and reassess whether that person should be in prison for the rest of their lives. On the right is top right is Brian Stevenson, and he is, there are films about him now. There he is in front of the Supreme Court. He argued one of the Supreme Court cases that scaled back life without parole sentences for people convicted as under the age of 18 as juveniles. On the bottom right is Rick Ramish, the former head of corrections in Colorado. And what he did was that he limited solitary confinement in his state to 15 days maximum, and only for very serious offenses in prison. Whereas if you look in other states, people will be sent to solitary for months or years on end, sometimes for very trivial things. Next to on the bottom left there is Jack Wilson. He's a defense attorney in California, and he's actually testifying there in the legislature in support of a felony murder reform bill that passed and reduced what would be considered felony murder and qualify for a mandatory 25 to life sentence in that state. And in the middle is Erica Felder and her colleagues with Hearts for Inmates. They're an advocacy group in South Carolina, and what they're trying to do is scale back the truth in sentencing requirement in that state for people, including for people with violent convictions, so that instead of people having to serve 85% of their sentence before they can be released, they can serve 65% of their sentence. And similar legislation has been successful in even some southern neighboring states. So these are some examples to show you that there's growing recognition that we need to set back very long sentences for violent crimes as part of a meaningful effort to end mass incarceration. And these are some examples of people that are working toward that or who've had success in achieving that goal. Okay, so now I want to talk to you about, and I will have time at the end for questions, but so let me go over with you first, though, some information about racial disparities in incarceration. Let me tell you about the scale of it, and then tell you about what causes it and examples of reforms to tackle racial disparities. So this is an analysis that was done based on imprisonment rates in 2001. And what this analysis showed, and this was done by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, showed that for people that were born in 2001, so that would be people that are about 19 years old now, this is their lifetime likelihood of going to prison. And remember, this is not jail, this is a prison sentence of a year or longer. And you can see the population that really stands out for me is African American men, young men. So the lifetime likelihood that they will be imprisoned is 1 in 3. If we continue at the imprisonment rates that we were having in 2001. Since 2001, African American men and women, and really everyone's imprisonment rates have come down slightly. So things have gotten a little bit better, but not dramatically. And this analysis hasn't been updated because it's really quite complicated to do. But this gives you a sense of the level of disparity that we see. So African American men are 6 times as likely to be imprisoned at some point in their lives than white men. And Latino men are about 3 times as likely as white men to experience imprisonment. And there's similar racial disparities for women as well, but women overall are less likely to become imprisoned than men over their lifetimes. So this is showing you this information by race and by gender. It's also really important, and I'm not going to show you the charts regarding this, but it's important to note that there are a lot of disparities in terms of class. So if you measure class, socioeconomic status, one way you can do it is looking at educational levels. And what you would see is that for Black men who don't have a high school degree, about 2/3 of them are likely to experience imprisonment. For Black men that have a college degree, it's a much smaller proportion that will experience imprisonment. But even when you when you look at education levels, and if you just look at college graduates, you would still see racial disparities in imprisonment, even in people with the highest levels of education. Okay, so why are people of color imprisoned at a higher rate than whites? So what are some of the things that you think are driving this? I want to know what your ideas are, and then I'll talk to you about a framework that I have of putting together the different factors that are driving this. Okay, so I'm going to over so I can see what you're writing here. Okay, so what are some of your ideas about why do we see such racial disparities in imprisonment? Okay, I see bias, 13th Amendment, racist system, prejudice. Great. Great. And the fact that Black people are more likely to live in lower socioeconomic status. Wow, a lot of answers coming. Thank you. Broken windows policing, systemic racism. Great. Thank you so much for chiming in here. And let me show you my framework here. Okay, so why is this? The way that I usually start off to frame this is to present these charts. And what these two sets of graphics show you is the kinds of explanations that people tend to go to. Some people say, oh, well, there are differences in racial differences in incarceration levels because of crime. And some people say, well, it's just bias and racism and prejudice in the system. My answer to this is that, well, it's both of these things. And so let me explain to you about this, and because I think it's really important to understand both of these sources so that we can tackle and come up with the right solutions in order to address them. Okay, so on the left-hand side, you see homicide victimization rates by race. And what you can see there is Black Americans are much more likely to be victims of homicide than white Americans during the time period that's shown there, and it's still true now. So this is how likely people are to be victims of homicide, not how likely they are to criminally offend. But homicide is an intra-racial crime. People generally kill other people of the same race or ethnicity. And so that means there are higher rates of homicide offending. Black Americans are more likely to commit homicide than white Americans. The reason for that has to do with who lives in concentrated urban poverty in the United States. Who tends to live in urban neighborhoods with failing schools, with failing hospitals, with segregated, that are extremely segregated and have very limited opportunities. That tends to be Black Americans. If you somehow flip the script on our society and you made it so that whites had far less wealth and were segregated in dense urban areas the way Black Americans are, and the racism in our society was actually reverse racism, you would probably see these lines flip around. So change homicide patterns and violent victimization and offending patterns requires figuring out how to address the kinds of the disparities and opportunities that we see in our society. So there are differences in differences in rates of criminal offending when you look at the most serious crimes, but there aren't differences in criminal offending when you look at the least serious crimes. And so look at the right-hand side. There you see marijuana use and marijuana possession arrests. So if you ask people and you look at data on how often people use marijuana, it's actually almost no racial disparity between Blacks and whites. But if you look at how often people are arrested for marijuana possession, not sales, just possession, you can see a lot of disparity between Blacks and whites. So this is based on analysis that the ACLU did, and what they found was that Blacks are 3.7 times as likely to be arrested for marijuana possession compared to whites, even though their usage of marijuana is nearly identical. So I think that an offense like this illustrates how it's not some underlying difference in behavior, but it's how our criminal justice system is processing people very differently that contributes to a disparity. And so, especially with lower level crimes, like with drug crimes, and with lower level property offenses, it's not an underlying difference in the criminal activity that we see, but there's a lot of disparity in how the criminal justice system reacts. But even for more serious crimes, and including for homicide, we know that there's criminal justice bias there as well. In particular, the bias that we see with homicide tends to be that if you have a combination of an African American person who's killed a white victim, that's the combination that's most likely to get press attention and most likely to be very severely punished in our system compared to other pairings of homicide. Okay, so I'm going to focus on, just going back here, I'm going to focus on the right-hand side, the sources of racial disparity that come from within our criminal justice system. Because I think what's happening on the left-hand side, it requires a different set of tools. It does require the criminal justice system to not make socioeconomic disparities even worse, which it does do. But on the right-hand side, that's really, the audience that I think of criminal justice practitioners, policymakers that are setting laws and setting policies for that population. That's really where, one area that the criminal justice system can focus internally and try to address that source of bias in the system. And so the kinds of biases that we see from within our system, they come from racial bias in the use of discretion. And I'm going to go over each of these with examples. The disparate racial impact of race-neutral policies, that's number 2. Number 3 is policies and decisions that disadvantage low-income people. Number 4 is policies that exacerbate socioeconomic inequality. Okay, let me just see quickly how much time I've got. Okay, so let me give you a couple examples of each of these. So racial bias in the use of discretion. So this has to do with this idea of who do police officers pull over? Are they racial profiling and things like that? And not just police officers, but also prosecutors. Who do prosecutors decide to bring a charge against that carries a mandatory minimum sentence? The research is clear that they tend to bring charges that carry mandatory sentences against people of color. Who do judges give some advantage to? White defendants or black defendants? What about jurors? Who do they give the benefit of the doubt to? Again, there's an abundance of research that shows that every stage of the criminal justice process where someone has to use their discretion and say, let me think about this person that I just stopped or that's in front of me. Are they someone that just got in trouble this one time and I should give them a break and let them go back to their lives and they've learned enough of a lesson already? Or is this probably someone who's going to criminally offend again, and I better really use this opportunity to punish them and try to correct the situation? Because of implicit bias, not even just overt bias of we hear reports now of police officers that are members of white supremacist groups online and things like that. That's a problem, certainly, but a broader problem we have within every part of our society is implicit bias. People that say, I want there to be racial equality. I don't want to produce biased outcomes, but unless they closely monitor their work, they're almost inevitably going to produce biased outcomes, especially if they're white and even if they're a person of color, just because of the function of how our society works, how we've been trained from television, from media, to think about who's likely to be a criminal and who's not. So the graphic here on the left shows you an analysis that was done in Kansas City, and it shows you how often people were pulled over for investigatory traffic stops. And you can see that black men and women were more likely than white men and women to be pulled over for these traffic stops. This was true for young drivers, which are shown here, but also for older drivers. What are investigatory traffic stops? Investigatory traffic stops are also known as pretext stops. These are stops where the officer is pulling someone over just to investigate them to see if they have drugs on them or a weapon. And the reason that they'll pull people over is they'll say things like, oh, well, you didn't signal when you changed lanes, or you were driving a little too slow, or just no reason at all, rather than I pulled you over because you were going 20 miles over the speed limit. That would be considered, that's a different kind of traffic stop. That would be, now I'm forgetting the name of the other kind of traffic stop. Let me see if I can pull it up. But so basically the traffic stops can be split up into these two different kinds, one being the investigatory kind, okay, and the other one being just safety stops or reactive traffic stops. And black drivers are more likely to be pulled over for these investigatory reasons. Once they're pulled over, they're more likely to be searched than white drivers. And police officers search black drivers at such a high rate that often in many jurisdictions, they're less likely to find drugs and weapons on black drivers that they've searched than on white drivers, because they're better and more effective at identifying the white drivers that are likely to have contraband. Okay, so that has to do with bias in the individual decision maker. But I think it's really important to go beyond that. So this is an example of, so the second source of disparity is policies that have a disparate racial impact. So the examples of this would be the crack cocaine sentencing disparity that existed at the federal level. It used to be 100 to 1, and now it's 18 to 1. Another example of this would be drug-free school zones. So you may have signs like this around your school where it proclaims that this is a drug-free school zone, and the idea is that if someone's selling drugs within some distance around your school, they will get a harsher sentence than if someone is selling drugs farther from a school area. Because the idea behind these laws is that we don't want kids to be near drug trades, drug selling, and to have access to drugs. But what happens is that when you have drug-free school zones, like here is how the drug-free school zone used to look like in Indianapolis, much of the city becomes a drug-free school zone, and because drug-free school zones will not just consider schools, they'll also consider daycare centers, and sometimes they'll include public housing and things like that. And so what are the demographics of who tends to live in cities and who tends to live in rural and suburban places? Black Americans and Latino are more likely to live in urban areas, and they're more likely to get the sentencing enhancement that comes with a drug-free school zone. Another example of policy with the disparate racial impact is stop and frisk, which broken windows policing, which some of you mentioned earlier. So those policing policies are not about how one officer decides to pull someone over or not. Those are departmental-wide policies explaining to officers and guiding them about where they need to target their efforts and what kind of work they should be doing. Okay, so the third source of economic disadvantage has to do with the third source of racial disparity in the justice system has to do with economic disadvantage. The fact that if you're poor, you will have a worse outcome, chances are, than if you're wealthy. And that's because if you're poor, you're more likely to be held pre-trial and you won't be able to post bail to be released. That was the case with Khalif Browder, who spent 3 years on Rikers Island as a teenager, a substantial portion of that time held in solitary confinement, and a while after he was released and really damaged from that experience, he killed himself. So that's an extreme outcome of someone's reaction and very bad experience of going through the justice system without financial means. But what happens much more commonly is that someone's arrested and they're held pre-trial and they take a plea offer that includes probation. And if they trip up on the terms of their probation, miss a meeting with their probation officer, get tested and found with drugs, with marijuana even in their system, they'll be incarcerated. So that's how being poor makes it more likely for you to be incarcerated. And also, if you're reliant on indigent defense, your public defender, many public defenders' offices are underfunded. And so if you have access to financial resources to hire a very high quality experienced attorney, that person's going to be able to dedicate a lot more resources to your case than a public defender, and they can probably negotiate a better outcome for you. And then the fourth way that the criminal justice system contributes to racial disparities is the way that it makes people poorer after its contact with them. So over here at the top, you can see the box asking people for whether or not they have a criminal history when they apply for a job. Many job applications include a question about criminal history. So do many landlords. They ask about criminal history, or they'll do background checks. If you have a drug conviction, it makes it very hard for you in certain states to access cash-assisted food stamps. So all of this makes it so that once you're done with your sentence, you're going to still experience lifelong of punishment. In employment, in housing, in many other aspects of your life, including in your ability to vote, depending on where you live. If you live in a place like Florida, until recently with their reforms, you would have been banned for life to vote, unless the governor specifically said, okay, I'm going to re-enfranchise you. So these are very serious obstacles that people face. And in addition to that, the last bullet that I have there points to the fact that because we invest so heavily in the criminal justice system and in punishment and in policing, we underinvest in other more effective ways of tackling crime and tackling substance use disorder, like making sure everyone has access to drug treatment and investing in crime prevention programs. So now really quickly, I want to just share with you some examples of reforms to tackle these sources of bias in the justice system. To tackle bias in the use of discretion, there's implicit bias training, which is not nearly enough, but it's something. Often, for it to be effective, it needs to be coupled with monitoring and accountability in terms of the decisions that people are making. And we've seen that happen in the Milwaukee, Wisconsin prosecutor's office around drug paraphernalia charges to make sure that people of color are not charged with drug paraphernalia more often than their equivalent white counterparts. Modifying policies with a disparate racial impact. Indiana and Connecticut have amended their drug-free school zones. So Indiana, which I showed you Indianapolis's map, they've scaled back their drug-free school zones to 500 feet. They've moved public housing facilities from drug-free school zones, and they also have a requirement that students should reasonably be expected to be present. So if you're selling drugs near a school on a Sunday when school's closed, it doesn't make sense to have a longer sentence because you're near a school at that time. Other examples, New York curbed its stop and frisk policy as a result of a court case finding that it was unconstitutional. They've also scaled back broken windows policing. A number of states have been passing legislation requiring a racial impact analysis, so that when criminal law is being considered, the disparate racial impact can be anticipated in advance and corrected for. Easing economic burdens, I'm going to just focus on the bottom bullet here. New Jersey has reformed its bail system, and a number of other states are considering doing the same, and they've actually, or have temporarily done it during the pandemic, to make it so that people are only held pretrial if they're actually a public safety risk or a flight risk, not just because they can't afford to post bail. And then the final solution addressing collateral consequences, those lifelong consequences are called collateral consequences. A number of states ban the box now, which is actually delaying the box so that employers don't ask right away about criminal history. When someone's applying for a job, they can ask after they've made an offer. They can get that information and revise their offer if they want to. A number of states have eliminated the ban on cash assistance and food stamps for people that have felony drug convictions. And California is an example of a state that is engaged in a very meaningful justice reinvestment policy where it's scaling penalties, in this case for low-level offenses, and reinvesting those savings into crime prevention efforts. And remember, I showed this to you earlier, tackling the left-hand side to address racial disparities in crime. I just wanted to reiterate again that that's not going to be solved by the kinds of reforms I was describing. To tackle what's going on the left there, that's where we really need to think about how do we make our communities, our health system, our educational system actually present people with equal opportunities and actually design them in a way to address the multi-generational inequities that we are seeing right now. So I'm going to stop there, and I would love to have some questions from you and comments. Okay, Sean, go ahead if you can.
Hi, Doctor. First of all, thanks for coming on the call today and teaching us about this. This is like really invigorating and exciting, and it's going to be pumped up for this debate topic. But my question was concerning LGBTQ plus disparities within the criminal justice system. I was wondering if you had like any data compiled on that or just knew some facts off the top of your head.
Sure. So I don't follow that issue super closely, and I appreciate that you brought it up. But what I know is that there are definitely issues around that in terms of the conditions of confinement and people that are incarcerated getting the kinds of services and treatment that they need. And in addition to that, I think that this issue comes up also around thinking about decriminalization. So, for example, when we think about moving away from relying on the criminal justice system for drug offenses, some people advocate for that for sex work as well. And so it's especially around that kind of decriminalization effort where people, LGBTQ community is very much impacted, and many in that community, many of the leaders really advocate for thinking about how their community is disproportionately impacted and harmed because of the criminalization that we have right now. So thanks for bringing that up. Okay, now I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Okay, Clarissa, I see that you're there. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay, so one of my questions was about your 20-year confinement, like not lifelong. How would we protect them from other people that could harm them because of their crimes? Or that would harm them?
Yeah,
So,
do you mean while they're incarcerated or afterwards?
Afterwards.
Yeah, I think that that's a great question. And this idea of retribution, of people harming other people because of their crime, that's one of the functions of why we have prison in the first place. So that when someone is harmed, they don't feel the need to respond themselves. They can trust that the government is going to do something in response for them. So I would say that after 20 years, there, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about how much of a threat it is because, while people are incarcerated, a lot of times people who have sex offenses, for example, are very much at risk of other people in prison, and so they're held in separate facilities. I think that like if someone's really at risk once they're released, there's like witness protection programs and things like that considered. But I would expect that largely after 20 years, someone's not going to, the survivors have had a chance to cool off. And ideally, what we would do is do a lot more to invest in helping victims and survivors recover and from the harm that they've experienced. And so I should say that I think that's an important part of it as well. But let's see. There's one other thing I wanted to mention about that. Yeah. Oh, and I think it's important to note that a lot of people that are in prison right now with very long sentences, they actually have the people that are related to their victim, for example, a lot of times support their release. And the judges, their sentencing judges, a lot of times support their release. But even despite that, they're still incarcerated. So there's a large number of people where the community that was most closely impacted supports their release, and one would not expect to see harm there. Okay, so Alexander, thanks for your question.
So I ended up forgetting, but what was the problem with the drug-free school zones?
The problem with drug-free school zone is that they end up often blanketing urban areas. That large parts of urban areas become a drug-free school zone, whereas if you live in the suburbs or in a rural area, if the 500 feet or whatever around the school, it's very easy to find yourself outside of that area. But if you're in an urban, if you're in a city, much of the city is basically going to be considered a drug-free school zone, and so that ends up making it so that if you do the same thing in a city as in a suburb or rural area, you're going to get a longer sentence, and that disproportionately affects people of color.
All right.
Okay, Sean is next.
Another issue that interests me is means of restorative justice. So the one I've been researching is like victim offender mediation used in Canada, New Zealand, I believe. Some parts of the United States. Do you have any opinions or thoughts on that?
Definitely. So I think that restorative justice is really important, and there are a number of examples of I think where we've seen it really pick up most is in schools. But there are a couple examples now, like there's a woman, her name is Danielle Sered, S-E-R-E-D, and she has written a book, I think it's called Until We Reckon. And so in it, she describes the restorative justice program that she started in Brooklyn and the Bronx as a pilot program, which includes people that have committed violent crimes. which brings in the victim and victims who want that option, and allows them to think about, what would be ways of making them whole again, or making them of somehow making up for the harm that they've experienced. And so I think that's really important work, and it really underlines how within the system that we have now, there's really a lack of attention to helping victims and survivors recover from the experience that they've had. And restorative justice can really do a lot to fill in that gap. Thanks. Okay, back. So now we're going to go to Ivy.
Bear with me while I get my phrasing together, but of course, like socioeconomic status and race have become sort of intertwined because of, systemic racism, redlining, and things like that. But do you think that one is ultimately more divisive than another when looking at how you will be treated in the criminal justice system? Like, do you think it's more divided by poorer areas, for lack of a better term, than race? Or do you think that it's more predominantly like race over the other?
Mm-hmm. That's a tough one for me to answer. I know that there's a political science professor at University of Pennsylvania. Her name is Marie Gottschalk, and she's written a really great book about this issue. And one of the arguments that she's made, and she's written a number of essays as well, and one of her arguments that she makes is that people need to realize that in the United States, we have a lot of racial disparities, but we also just have an overall very high level of incarceration. And so even if there were no Black Americans or people of color at all in prisons, we would still have several times the incarceration rate of our European peer countries. So even if the only people in prison in the United States were whites, we would still have a mass incarceration problem. So I think that so that's important to note. But at the same time, I'm more persuaded by arguments that the criminal justice system that we have in place now is really one that policymakers designed with, in particular, Black Americans in mind. And that's why partly it's so punitive, and that's why instead of getting to the root of why we have crime and getting to the root of of addressing the harm that crime causes, instead we have what we have, which is really not much to be proud of, I think, in terms of how it leaves victims feeling at the end of going through the process, and what has contributed to crime rates, and how much harm it causes people that are going through the system and their families. Thanks. Okay, let's see. And I see. Okay, so Krivo.
Okay, hold on.
Sure.
Yeah, okay. So I guess I have a question. So one of the major solutions mentioned was, well, basically rehabilitation, and I guess my question is, the country's rehabilitation system, the way that it is now, is minimal. What would you say would be a system which we could realistically put in place in good time that would replace and help curb this problem of mass incarceration?
Yeah, okay, great. So, this is a question that I've actually seen when I've advocated for the second look bill in DC, which allows for people to be resentenced for crimes after they serve 15 years if their crime happened under the age of 25. And people will sometimes make that exact argument. They'll say, well, given that we know our criminal justice system is a failure and so many people go back to prison, why would we want people to come out earlier and more people to come out? And so my response to that is, and I think it's informed by meeting people that have been released from long prison sentences, that it is the case that we don't invest enough in rehabilitation programs, and we need to do more. And there's been, especially starting with even under George W. Bush's administration, where there was a reentry it was second, it's a second chance law, I think is what they called it. I'm trying to remember the name of it, but so he sort of publicly declared that a commitment and dedicated some federal funding to investing in reentry and helping people successfully reenter society. And so under our current president as well, there's been a little bit more investment into drug rehabilitation in federal prisons and willingness to consider giving people access to Pell Grants to be able to take college classes in prison. So there's slowly more happening. But at the same time, I think from my experience of talking to people that have served long sentences, there's the aging out of crime effect that really can't be underestimated, that even though prisons fail overwhelmingly to do what they need to do, people figure it out for themselves, because the people that are going into prison at age 17, 18, 19, 20, once they're 35, 40, by that time, they really invested and taken the time to figure out, what's going on, what has happened, what led them to their crime, what can they do to self-improve. And a lot of times even the prisons and the prison wardens, for example, recognize that these older people are really great role models, and they try to get them to become mentors to younger people in prison and so on. So I would say that despite the shortcomings in rehabilitation, people mature and they age out of crime, and so really deserve a second chance at returning to our society. Okay, I think I see, let's see. Okay, I think I see one more question from Sean here.
Just wondering about your stance on the overall impact of mandatory minimum sentencing. As I stated before, that was the evidence that I had read from you.
Yeah, so mandatory minimum sentencing, I would say, is one of the sort of 3 reasons why we have mass incarceration. Because the reasons we are here are the war on drugs, the fact that once people are charged and convicted, they're more likely to get sent to prison rather than to get their charge dismissed or to get a community supervision term. And once they're sent to prison, they serve much longer sentences. And mandatory minimum sentences are a major way that that's happened. So my view is that it would be much better to get rid of as many mandatories as possible and allow judges to use their discretion and expertise to sentence people. Part of the idea about mandatories was to get rid of racial disparities in discretion. But what we know what's happened actually is that instead of allowing judges' bias to manifest in sentencing, what mandatory sentencing does is that it shifts that opening to prosecutors, because prosecutors decide who they're going to bring charges against that carry a mandatory sentence. And so instead of getting rid of the racial disparities, we still have them. If they've just been shifted, and they've actually been shifted to an office that's less transparent than the judiciary. Did you have a follow-up?
Yes, it was concerning, I forgot it actually, sorry.
That's okay.
Maybe it'll come to me.
Okay, so Madeline?
Yeah. So related to that, would you say that that's why white people tend to be undercharged?
That's why. I think that's definitely part of the reason why white people are undercharged. Yeah, so that they can avoid mandatory sentences. So that the prosecutor makes the calculation that, I don't want, this is likely to not be a criminal. This is likely to be someone who just got in trouble once, and let me not get them caught up too severely in the system. Mm-hmm.
Sweet, thank you. I just wanted to make sure before I wrote that down.
Sure. Okay. Yes, go ahead. Michelle, did you have a question?
No, I was gonna jump in if everybody was done and kind of do a little send-off thing, but
sure.
if anyone else has any last questions.
I remembered mine now. It just took a second. It was concerning how European countries, specifically I read stuff about Finland, have reformed their criminal justice systems.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So what was your question about it?
If you could just like talk about it, or like any other country, it doesn't necessarily need to be within Europe.
Yeah, so those countries have much more humane prison systems generally, and they have a real priority of rehabilitation instead of punishment. Whereas in this country, we're still trying to undo what happened in the 1990s in particular, which was considered sort of a takeaway period where people decided that people in prison shouldn't have access to cable, they shouldn't have access to college education, they shouldn't have access to things that they struggle to have access to themselves. And so it sort of pitted people in prison against broader communities that were also financially struggling, and made it so that prisons became much more of a warehouse rather than a place to help people, patch up and pick up the skills that they were missing in their communities. So yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Doctor. Jackie had to step out, so I'm going to thank you so much, everybody. I wish there was an applause function, but thank you so much. For my class, we're going to take a short 5-minute break and then head back to our room. Tyler, I don't know what you want to do with your kids, so I'll let you.
Yeah, you can just meet us in the novice policy skills session room.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much, Doctor.
Bye, everyone. Good luck.
Bye.
All right. So, meet you back in 5 minutes.